1890, the United States Census Bureau sat down and did something it had never done before. It tried to count the millionaires. Not estimate, not guess. Actually, count them, name by name, fortune by fortune. What they found was so strange, so concentrated, so almost unbelievable, that the report was buried in government archives for decades before historians finally started pulling it apart. There were roughly 4,047 millionaires in the entire country. In a nation of 63 million people, that number is already startling enough. But the real shock was not the size of the club. It was how the club got built. When researchers traced those fortunes back to their origins, the same surnames kept appearing. The same business partnerships, the same banks, the same railroad contracts, the same land deals, and when they pushed the origins far enough back, nearly every major Gilded Age dynasty traced its founding wealth to a window of roughly 40 years, somewhere between 1845 and 1885. Before that window, with very few exceptions, these families were nobody: farmers, clerks, immigrants with almost nothing in their pockets. So the question that nobody in 1890 wanted to ask out loud was this: how did a handful of families go from nothing to controlling the economy of the most powerful industrializing nation on earth in less than 2 human generations? And why did it happen to those specific families, and not to the thousands of others who were standing in the same rooms, riding the same trains, living through the same era? The answer is not what the textbooks taught you, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. To understand what happened, you have to understand what America looked like in 1845, because it barely resembles the country those 4,047 millionaires would come to dominate. There was no national railroad network. There was no federal income tax. There was no Securities and Exchange Commission, no Sherman Antitrust Act, no Federal Reserve. The United States government collected most of its revenue from tariffs and land sales, and it spent most of that revenue on almost nothing. The country was a patchwork of regional economies loosely stitched together by rivers, canals, and dirt roads. A merchant in Boston operated in a fundamentally different financial world than a merchant in Cincinnati. Capital did not move freely. Information moved even less freely. If you wanted to know the price of grain in St. Louis, you might wait 2 weeks for a newspaper to arrive. What existed in place of institutions were relationships, networks of trust built on family connections, church affiliations, ethnic ties, and the kind of reputation that could only be built slowly, face to face, over years of small deals done honestly. These networks were the invisible infrastructure of American commerce, and they were, for the most part, closed. The families who would become the dynasties of 1890 were, almost universally, already inside those networks by the time the great disruptions began. Not rich, not powerful, but connected. A young Cornelius Vanderbilt was ferrying passengers across New York Harbor because his family had been doing waterborne business in that region for generations. A young John D. Rockefeller got his first job as a bookkeeper through a family church connection in Cleveland. Jay Cooke, who would finance the Civil War and almost single-handedly invent the American bond market, came from a well-connected Ohio family with legal and political ties stretching back decades. This is not to say talent was irrelevant. These were, almost without exception, people of extraordinary ability, drive, and strategic intelligence. But talent in 1845 was everywhere. What was not everywhere was access. And access was the variable that separated the families who would explode into Gilded Age dynasties from the equally talented families who would not. The first great accelerant was the railroad, and the railroad did not reward those who built it nearly as much as it rewarded those who financed it. Between 1850 and 1870, the United States laid more railroad track than the rest of the world combined. The numbers are almost difficult to process. In 1840, the country had about 3,000 miles of track. By 1870, it had over 53,000 miles. This was not organic growth. This was a government-sponsored, land-subsidized, politically engineered explosion of infrastructure, and the people who understood how to navigate the relationship between private capital and government contract were positioned to capture extraordinary wealth from it. The federal government gave railroad companies more than 170 million acres of public land as incentive grants. To put that in perspective, that is an area larger than the state of Texas. The companies could sell that land, use it as collateral for loans, or develop it themselves. The families who held stock or bondholder positions in these companies did not need to know anything about engineering. They did not need to lay a single rail. They needed to be in the room when the contracts were written. Cornelius Vanderbilt understood this earlier than almost anyone. By the time most people recognized that railroads were going to consolidate, Vanderbilt had already started consolidating them. He acquired the New York and Harlem Railroad in 1862, the Hudson River Railroad in 1864, the New York Central in 1867. He was not building railroads. He was assembling a monopoly on the movement of people and goods into and out of the most commercially important city in America. When he died in 1877, he left an estate of roughly $100 million. Adjusted for the size of the economy at the time, it represented a share of American GDP that no individual fortune has matched since. What made Vanderbilt's trajectory possible was not just intelligence or aggression. It was that he was operating in a period before the rules existed, before antitrust law, before securities regulation, before the government had developed any serious mechanism for limiting the concentration of economic power. He was building inside a regulatory vacuum, and he was doing it with access to capital networks that were simply unavailable to the vast majority of Americans alive at the same moment. The same pattern repeated itself across every major Gilded Age dynasty, with small variations. Jay Cooke used his Philadelphia banking connections and his relationship with Treasury Secretary Salmon Chase to become the exclusive distributor of Union war bonds during the Civil War. He sold $1.6 billion in bonds to the American public, taking a commission on every single one. He effectively invented retail investment banking in America, and he did it with a government monopoly that no competitor could touch. Andrew Carnegie arrived in Pittsburgh as a poor Scottish immigrant, but his first real break came when he became personal secretary to Thomas Scott, a senior executive at the Pennsylvania Railroad. Scott recognized Carnegie's organizational abilities and began cutting him into investment opportunities that would otherwise have been invisible to a young man of his background. Carnegie's first significant investments were in railroad sleeping cars and railroad bridges. By the time he pivoted to steel, he had been inside the financial networks of industrial America for 20 years. John D. Rockefeller's rise followed a slightly different path, but the same fundamental logic. He recognized that oil refining, not oil drilling, was where durable wealth would accumulate. Drilling was a lottery. Refining was a business. But controlling refining required controlling something else first, something that most of his contemporaries failed to see clearly enough. It required controlling the railroads that moved the oil. Rockefeller negotiated secret rebate agreements with the major railroads, agreements in which Standard Oil would receive discounts on its shipping rates in exchange for guaranteed volume. Some of these agreements went further. The railroads actually paid Rockefeller a portion of the shipping fees that his competitors were paying. His competitors were unknowingly subsidizing his expansion. By 1880, Standard Oil controlled roughly 90% of American oil refining. It was not because Rockefeller made better oil. It was because he had locked up the logistics infrastructure that every refiner depended on. The families that did not make it into the Gilded Age aristocracy were not, by and large, less capable. The historical record is full of entrepreneurs and industrialists from the 1850s and 1860s who built real businesses, made real money, and then found themselves unable to survive contact with the dynasties that were forming around them. The difference was almost always the same: access to capital at the right moment, the right relationship with a government official who controlled a contract, a bank connection that allowed survival through a financial panic when competitors were being wiped out. The Panic of 1873 is the clearest example. Jay Cook's banking house collapsed and triggered the worst economic depression America had experienced to that point. Thousands of businesses failed. Hundreds of thousands of workers lost their employment. The depression lasted 6 years, and when it ended, the competitive landscape of American industry looked dramatically different than it had before. The survivors were almost exclusively the firms and families that had relationships with major banks, or that were already large enough to absorb losses that would have killed smaller competitors. This is how financial panics function as a mechanism of wealth consolidation. They do not destroy wealth evenly. They concentrate it. The families and firms with access to credit survive. The families and firms without it do not. And when the panic ends, the survivors find themselves operating in a market that has been cleared of the competition. Asset prices are depressed. Distressed properties are available for a fraction of their value. The window for acquisition is wide open, and only those with capital can walk through it. Rockefeller was explicit about this later in his life. He described the financial panics of the late 19th century as his greatest opportunities. When other refiners were desperate for cash, he was buying. When other railroads were in receivership, his allies were purchasing the bonds. The Panic of 1873, the Panic of 1884, the Panic of 1893. Each one reshuffled the deck. Each one left the major dynasties with a larger share of the hand. What is striking, looking back at this period, is how deliberately some of these families understood what they were doing. The correspondence that survives is remarkably candid. J.P. Morgan's letters discuss market corners, railroad agreements, and the deliberate management of financial panics with a directness that would be unthinkable in a modern business communication. These men did not experience themselves as operating outside any moral framework. The framework simply had not been built yet. They were writing the rules as they went, and they were writing them for themselves. By 1880, the major dynasties had largely crystallized. The specific families at the top of the Gilded Age pyramid were not going to be replaced by newcomers, because the newcomers could no longer access the conditions that had produced the dynasties in the first place. The railroad land grants were mostly allocated. The war bond monopolies were gone. The easiest moments of industrial consolidation had passed. What remained was the second-order process of dynasty construction, which was in some ways even more interesting than the first. The families had money. Now they needed to transmit it, protect it, and embed it into institutions that would outlast any single generation. The marriage networks of the Gilded Age are one of the most studied and least understood aspects of this process. The daughters of railroad fortunes married the sons of banking fortunes. The children of industrial dynasties married into established old money families from Boston and Philadelphia and New York. These were not romantic arrangements, or not primarily romantic. They were portfolio diversification strategies executed in human form. Each marriage created new relationships between families that had previously operated in different sectors, and those relationships created new investment opportunities, new access to capital, new political connections. The Vanderbilt family's matrimonial strategy in the 1870s and 1880s was executed with a precision that would have impressed a corporate merger team. Cornelius Vanderbilt's grandchildren married into British aristocracy, into old New York society, into the families that controlled major financial institutions. They were not trying to spend their money, they were trying to embed it in a web of relationships that would be very difficult to dislodge. The private club networks that formed during this period served a related function. The Union League Club, the Knickerbocker Club, the Metropolitan Club. These were not places for wealthy men to eat lunch. They were information exchanges and deal rooms and vetting mechanisms. Membership signaled you had been approved by people whose approval opened doors. Because the same names appeared across clubs in multiple cities, they created a network of coordination invisible to anyone outside it. The universities completed the architecture. Harvard, Yale, and Princeton were embedding mechanisms, places where the children of new industrial money met the children of old established money and formed friendships that would last entire careers. A Vanderbilt grandson at Yale in 1885 was not there for the education. He was being wired into a network that would determine every significant professional opportunity he would ever have. By 1890, all three systems together had produced something the founders of the Republic had explicitly tried to prevent. The window that made it possible had already begun to close. The architecture they built inside it has never come down. Every year, roughly 7 million people walk through St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City. They stare up at Michelangelo's dome. They touch the bronze foot of the St. Peter statue worn smooth by centuries of pilgrims. They take photos of the marble floors, listen to the tour guides, and leave believing they saw the Vatican. But underneath their feet, past the crypts and the papal tombs and everything a tourist is ever shown, there's another structure. A structure the Vatican has known about for almost 100 years, where the stonework doesn't match, the scale doesn't match, and the timeline doesn't match anything in the official history of Rome. The deeper you go beneath St. Peter's Basilica, the less sense the building makes. Let's walk through what's actually down there. The official story is simple, and you've probably heard it a dozen times. St. Peter's Basilica, the centerpiece of Vatican City, began construction in 1506 under Pope Julius II. The project dragged on for over 100 years. Donato Bramante drew up the original plans. Michelangelo redesigned the dome. Carlo Maderno extended the nave. Gian Lorenzo Bernini finished St. Peter's Square with its famous curved colonnade in the 1600s. According to the church, this basilica was built directly over the tomb of St. Peter, on land that had been a Roman burial ground in the 1st century. The Romans used Vatican Hill as a cemetery because it was outside the city walls. St. Peter was supposedly crucified nearby in the Circus of Nero, buried on the hill, and 1500 years later, the Renaissance church was built to enshrine that tomb. That's the story on every tour, in every guidebook, on every plaque. But the story starts falling apart the moment you look at what's actually underneath. In 1939, Pope Pius XII authorized a secret excavation beneath the basilica. The world was descending into the Second World War. Rome was on edge. And in the middle of all of that, Vatican archaeologists began quietly digging into the foundations of the most famous building in Christianity. The project lasted more than a decade. They went deeper than anyone had gone before, and what they found was never fully released to the public. What we do know is that they uncovered an entire underground necropolis, rows of Roman tombs, pagan shrines, mosaics, sarcophagi, and burial chambers. The Vatican called it the Scavi, the excavations, and today you can book a tour of a small portion of it if you book months in advance. That's the only part they let you see. But archaeologists and independent researchers who've studied the published reports noticed something strange right away. The tombs weren't all from the same period. The styles didn't match. And the deeper layers, the ones closest to the bedrock of Vatican Hill, looked older than anything Roman historians could explain. That's the first mismatch. Walk through the Vatican Scavi tour and you'll see two completely different kinds of construction separated by only a few meters of rock. The upper layers are exactly what you'd expect from Renaissance Rome. Brick arches, quarried stone, fresco fragments, structural work consistent with what Italian builders were doing in the 15 and 1600s. Then you drop down a level, the masonry changes, the blocks get larger. Some of them are cut with precision that doesn't match the tools Roman engineers supposedly had. The mortar pattern changes. The scale of the construction suggests a building meant for something much bigger than a cemetery. In certain sections, the stonework looks closer to the ancient megalithic construction you see at sites like Baalbek in Lebanon or the oldest layers of Cusco in Peru. The blocks in these deeper layers are fitted together with joints so tight that no mortar was used or needed. You can see where the surfaces were ground against each other to create a seal. That's a technique associated with pre-Roman megalithic construction around the world. It takes enormous labour, specialised tools, and a level of engineering knowledge that doesn't show up in Roman training manuals. And yet, here it is, directly underneath the most famous Catholic church in the world. If the Roman necropolis was built in the 1st century, what exactly was it built on top of? The Vatican's official answer is that Vatican Hill was the site of the Circus of Nero, a Roman chariot stadium where Christians were martyred under Emperor Nero in the 60s. Adi St. Peter, according to tradition, was crucified upside down in this circus. His followers buried him on the hillside, and later generations built shrines over his tomb. That's the narrative. But here's the issue. No one has ever found a clear archaeological footprint of the Circus of Nero in the right location. Modern scholars argue over where it actually stood. Some place it south of the basilica, others place it partially underneath the building. The best the Vatican can offer is that the obelisk in St. Peter's Square today, the one you've seen in 1,000 photos of the Pope addressing crowds, once stood in that circus and was moved a few hundred meters in the 1500s. So the central proof of St. Peter's martyrdom site is an obelisk, a piece of Egyptian granite that was moved. And that obelisk has its own problem, which we'll get to in a minute. First, let's talk about what else is in the substructure. Underneath the Roman necropolis, before you hit the bedrock of Vatican Hill, archaeologists have documented pagan religious sites, shrines to Cybele, a goddess imported to Rome from Anatolia, Mithric imagery connected to the cult of Mithras, a pre-Christian mystery religion popular with Roman soldiers, fragments of older architecture that don't align with the necropolis grid, different orientations, different building techniques, different eras stacked on top of each other like geological layers. Vatican Hill, by the church's own admission, was considered sacred long before Christianity arrived. The name Vaticanus predates the Roman Empire. Ancient writers describe prophetic rituals being performed there centuries before Christ. The hill had a religious identity that the Roman authorities inherited and the Catholic Church later absorbed. But here's the question Tartaria researchers keep asking. If you keep digging past the pagan layers, past the early Roman layers, past the pre-Roman layers, what do you hit? That's where the Vatican stops talking. Now let's talk about the obelisk. Standing in the centre of St. Peter's Square today is a single piece of red granite. 83 feet tall, weighing somewhere around 320 metric tons, cut from a quarry in Aswan, Egypt, more than 2,000 years ago. The Egyptians carved it, shaped it, and dedicated it for some original purpose we no longer know. Because the inscriptions were removed, the Roman Emperor Caligula had it shipped from Alexandria to Rome in 40 AD in a ship so enormous that ancient historians said it was one of the largest vessels ever built. It was installed in what the church calls the Circus of Nero. Then in 1586 it was dragged across Rome by 900 workers and nearly 100 horses and re-erected in St. Peter's Square under Pope Sixtus V. That's the story. But think about what it implies. The Vatican's most symbolic plaza is anchored by a stone monument that was built for a completely different religion, carved by a completely different civilization, and originally stood somewhere else entirely. The Catholic Church topped it with a cross and called it their own, and the original Egyptian dedication scraped off, erased, no record preserved of what it said. Tartaria researchers argue this is the whole story of the Vatican in miniature. Take something older, claim it, and build your narrative on top of it, while the original meaning disappears. Before we go further, if this kind of hidden history investigation interests you, subscribe to the channel. I cover one of these buried stories every week, the ones the textbooks skip over and the tour guides won't touch. Now let's get into what's really underneath the necropolis. Beyond the tombs, Vatican engineers have documented an extensive system of drainage channels, water shafts and stone-lined passages running underneath the basilica and extending out beneath Vatican City. Some of it is attributed to Roman hydraulic work, which is reasonable because the Romans were excellent engineers. But the scale of the system in certain places is larger than what a cemetery would ever require. You don't build industrial drainage for a necropolis, you build it for a city. Researchers who've studied the limited maps that have leaked out point to channels that run past the basilica, connect to older Roman infrastructure like the Cloaca Maxima, and in some cases descend to depths that have never been officially surveyed. These aren't the little drainage ditches you dig under a church. These are tunnels a person can walk through standing upright, built with fitted stones that predate the medieval layers above them. Some of the passages branch out under St. Peter's Square itself. Others head east toward the Tiber River. A few descend at steep angles toward levels that have never been mapped on any public document. Engineers who worked on modern Vatican restoration projects have described finding stone-lined shafts with no clear purpose, accessible only through hatches that were bricked over centuries ago. What was the surface level of Vatican Hill before the necropolis? What stood there? And why are there drainage and utility features that make more sense under a large occupied complex than under a burial ground? The Vatican has answered exactly 0 of these questions publicly. Deeper still is a feature known as the Red Wall. Behind the main altar of St. Peter's Basilica, in the lowest layer of the scavi, there's a wall painted in red plaster. The Vatican calls this the Red Wall and claims it enclosed the original tomb of St. Peter. Next to the wall is a small niche called the Trophy of Gaius, named after a 2nd century writer who mentioned a monument to Peter on this spot. For Catholics, this is the most sacred archaeological feature in Christianity. The Vatican claims that in the 1940s, bones were found in a hidden chamber behind the Red Wall, and after testing, Pope Paul VI announced in 1968 that these were the bones of St. Peter. But the archaeological reality is more complicated. The bones were not found in one place. They were moved. The graffiti layers on the Red Wall include inscriptions in multiple languages from different centuries. The dating of the plaster has been disputed, and the wall itself was built up against an older structure, one that shows evidence of a different construction phase entirely. The Red Wall isn't the beginning of the story, it's the Vatican's chosen starting point for the story. What came before is deliberately out of frame. Tartaria researchers argue the Red Wall is a literal example of the erasure pattern. Paint over the older structure, label the new surface as the sacred thing. Bury the history underneath. Now here's where the architectural anomalies get really strange. In certain sections of the Lower Vatican, researchers who've gained limited access have reported seeing load-bearing arches, stone joints and precision-cut corners that don't fit the accepted timeline for Roman construction. There are blocks fitted without mortar so tightly that a razor blade can't slip between them. There are rooms with acoustic properties that seem deliberately engineered. Sound carries in ways that suggest the chambers were designed for ritual or broadcast. There are also doorways with perfectly level thresholds cut into single pieces of stone that weigh several tons each. Lintels that span openings wider than Roman construction manuals say was possible. Corner blocks with angles so precise they match modern machine tolerances. You can find similar stonework in Egypt, in the Andes, in parts of the Middle East that predate every known empire. The fact that it's also sitting under the Vatican is something nobody wants to write a paper about. These features don't appear in the tourist section of the Scavi. You won't see them on the Vatican's official tour. They show up in restricted access areas that require special permission, which is almost never granted to outside scholars. One researcher who gained access in the early 2000s described the experience as walking through two buildings at once. The Roman layer on top and something much older underneath, something that was there first. Something the Romans had already built around when they began burying their dead on Vatican Hill. This is the pattern Tartaria theorists have been documenting for years. Go to St. Petersburg, go to Washington DC, go to Istanbul, Paris, Delhi, or half a dozen cities in India and Southeast Asia. In almost every major capital, you'll find the same thing. Massive, anomalous structures with architectural features that don't fit the claimed construction date. Foundations that go deeper than they should. Lower floors with stonework that doesn't match the upper floors. Stories about buildings that were constructed in suspiciously short time frames with suspiciously little documentation. Look at the St. Isaac's Cathedral in St. Petersburg, officially built in the 1800s, but the granite columns weigh over 100 tons each, and the official construction records contradict themselves about how they were moved and raised. Look at the older layers under the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, or the foundations under the Capitol building in Washington DC, or the lower halls under the Red Fort in Delhi. The same pattern appears again and again. An official construction story that sounds clean on the surface, and a lower structure that doesn't match. The Tartaria theory, in its simplest form, says that there was an earlier global civilization, that its buildings were inherited, repurposed, relabeled, and folded into the histories we now accept. That the Vatican isn't an exception to this pattern. It's one of the clearest examples of it. You don't have to believe the whole theory to notice the mismatches, and the Vatican mismatches are some of the most documented in the world precisely because so many serious people have walked through the lower levels and come out confused. Which brings us to what the Vatican still won't show. The Scavi tour, the one a tourist can actually book, covers less than 10% of the documented underground space beneath the basilica. Beyond that, there are sealed chambers, restricted passages, areas that show up on old engineering diagrams and then quietly disappear from newer maps. The Vatican Secret Archives, which were renamed the Apostolic Archive in 2019 to sound less ominous, contain documents about the construction history of the basilica that have never been made public. Some of the sealed chambers are almost certainly just storage. Some are probably crypts the church doesn't want disturbed, that's fair. But the pattern of what's been off limits for decades lines up exactly with the areas where the architectural mismatches are deepest, and the church has given no indication that it plans to ever open them for independent investigation. If the story is as simple as the official narrative claims, why the secrecy? If Vatican Hill is just a Roman cemetery with a basilica on top of it, why do the lower halls look like something from a civilization nobody will name? If the obelisk in St. Peter's Square is Egyptian, the pagan shrines underneath are older than Rome, the hydraulic system serves something bigger than a graveyard, and the masonry at the deepest levels doesn't match any known Roman technology, then what exactly was on Vatican Hill before the Vatican? The tour guides won't tell you, the archives won't release the answer, the lower halls don't match the upper halls, and the church has never explained why. So the question stays where it's always been, sitting right underneath St. Peter's Basilica, buried. If you want to see more investigations like this one, I covered a site even stranger than the Vatican last week. a building in Eastern Europe that officially didn't exist until the 1900s, even though it appears on maps from the 1500s. The video is on screen, click it now.